My name is John Larg. I was hanged in Perth in 1817, and I regularly come from the cold grave to take tours round Perth and Dunkeld, telling stories of the dark past. But I can be found wherever there's been murder, witchcraft, battles fought, or executions carried out. And today I'm in Crieff at the old toll booth, and I will be telling you some stories from the town's dark past and tales from the wider area. Come with me. Crieff sits on the Highland line, the gateway between two distinctive cultures. To the north, the Highlander, who spoke Gaelic, who dressed in a tartan plaid, and who lived in big groups called clans. They showed no allegiance to the King of Scots, but to the clan chiefs. Their economy was based on cattle because the land was so barren. To the south of Crieff, the more anglicised Scot, who spoke a lowland form of English, who dressed like our southern neighbours. The farmers of Strathearn would often be raided by Highland raiders or caterans, unless they paid the black mail, money that you would pay to the men who would steal your cattle unless you paid this cash. The Highland cattle raider caught would be brought here to Crieff. They'd be tried and, if found guilty, sentenced to death. Lesser crimes would be put on the town's stocks for all to see. They'd be ridiculed, mocked, laughed at. Those sentenced to death would be taken to the kind gallows of Crieff. No one knows why these gallows were called the kind gallows. There's a couple of different theories, but I won't go into that. The gallows sat to the south and a little to the west of Crieff. The men and women who were hanged there, many of them have been lost to us as the records have disappeared, but there are a couple of good stories. The Reverend Richard Duncan, the minister at Kinkell, little to the east of Crieff, was found guilty of murdering his illegitimate child, a baby he had to one of his servants. Duncan was brought to Crieff, tried and found guilty for this murder. He was sentenced to death. He denied any involvement in this throughout the rest of his life. When the day of the execution came, he'd be taken down to the kind gallows. A big crowd had gathered. The hangman would make Duncan climb up a few runs in a ladder that was propped up against the gallows post. When the time for execution arrived, the hangman would turn Duncan from this ladder, and he would hang. He would strangle slowly at the end of the noose. Duncan had just died, and death had come to pick up its prize when a messenger was seen from the south. This messenger had a letter. This letter was a pardon for Richard Duncan, but unfortunately it came just too late. This next story is a fantastic story, and I can't remember where I heard it, but I've known it for a while. It involves a farmer from the Highlands who sent his boy to the market of Falkirk to sell some cows. As the young man left, he waved towards his father and told him he'd be back in a week or two. A fortnight passed, and the boy had not returned. The farmer thought he could understand why his boy would be bewitched by the bright lights of Falkirk. But then 3 weeks and 4 weeks passed, and there was still no sign of this young man. The farmer was extremely worried, distraught. He would climb a nearby hill and spend the whole day gazing south, hoping to see some sign of his laddie's return, but to no avail. About 6 weeks after the boy had left for Falkirk, the farmer heard that a local neighbour was also heading down to the market at Falkirk. The farmer went to see this man, and he said to him, "When you're in Falkirk, do you mind asking around, seeing if you can find anything about my son? He's been away for about 6 weeks and he's never returned. I'm worried sick. Aye, I'll do that, said the neighbour. A couple of weeks later, the farmer had heard that the neighbour had returned, but he hadn't come to see him. Then a week after that, the couple met by chance on the road. The farmer said to his neighbour, "Did you have a good time at Falkirk?" Aye, I did, said the neighbour. "I sold my cattle for a good price. The market was busy." He said, "Did you ask about my son?" The neighbour thought for a minute or two and said, "It slipped my mind. I meant to tell you I saw your son." "You saw him?" said the farmer. "Where did you see him?" "I saw him in Crieff." "In Crieff? What was he doing in Crieff?" The neighbour thought and then said, "He was hanging for the gallows." This, I think, is a fantastic story. As I said, I don't know where I've read it, but I've known it for a while. Crieff is dominated by two families, the Drummonds and the Murrays. And this is the old market cross of Crieff, also known as the Drummond Cross. And these families were sort of hybrid between Highland clan and Lowland family. Often, these two families would fall out, and sometimes this would result in a bloody feud. And this incident happened either in 1490 or 1511. We're not quite sure when, but it certainly happened during the time of King James IV, King of Scots. The Murrays and the Drummonds fell out, and they fought a battle nearby called the Battle of Knockmary. The Drummonds won. They were reinforced with some men from Argyll. The Murrays all fled to their lands to the north and west of Crieff. The Drummonds also headed homewards. On the way, they met a large party of Campbells, led by Duncan Campbell of Dunstaffanage. Campbell was in the area looking for the Murrays who killed his father-in-law and two of his sons. He was wanting revenge. He persuaded the Drummonds to join his force, and together they marched upon the lands of the Murrays. The Murrays heard of this invasion force approaching their lands, and they realised they were not big enough to withstand a joint attack. So those men and women and children who did not flee into the hills all took shelter in the church of Moniverde. The Drummonds and Campbells started to loot the houses. When they'd taken all they wanted, they'd burned the buildings to the ground. All the cattle were gathered to be driven off and shared between the Drummonds and Campbells. The Murrays and the church could only look on helpless as they saw their livelihoods being destroyed. One man in the church picked up a bow. He aimed it from the window and shot an arrow in the direction of a Drummond clansman who was hit in the chest with this missile. The Drummond fell down dead. The Campbells and the Drummonds were furious. They had always known the Murrays were hiding in the church, but they'd stayed away from it, respecting the sanctity of the building. This was an outrage. They surrounded the church, they barricaded the front door, and then they set fire to the thatch. Inside, the men, women and children of the Murray clan would have realised what was happening as smoke started to billow downwards, making their eyes stream, them cough and splutter and struggle to breathe. Many of them ran at the front door and tried to burst out, but the door stood firm. Some would jump out the windows, but they were cut down immediately by Drummond or Campbell clansmen. Soon the whole church was ablaze. The screams of the people trapped inside would have been horrifying to listen to. At the end of the day, only one man survived. When he jumped out of a window, the Highlander facing him, a Drummond, was his cousin. The Drummond let his kinsman go by. This Drummond was thrown out the clan for this. He had to emigrate to Ireland. He returned later an old man, and the Murrays gratefully gave him some land. And this man was always known from then on as Drummond of Ernoch or Drummond of Ireland, and so were his kinsmen. No one knows how many people actually died in this church. There's been varied estimates from 20 Murray clansmen to 120. But if you take a conservative estimate, say there was maybe 30 clansmen in the church. They all would have taken their wives, that's 60. And on average, they all would have had at least one child, that's 90. 90 people burned to death in one day, more than were killed in the massacre of Glencoe. And we've all heard of the massacre of Glencoe, but who has heard of the massacre of Montverde? This next story is a ghost story, and I thought it would be good to finish with a ghost tale because we're coming up to Halloween. It involves a woman called Heather Meg, and as her name suggests, she made a living by selling lucky white heather around the area. One market day, she came to Crieff. Business was booming. She was selling lots and lots of her heather. Then she was approached by 3 young gentleman farmers. These men were from out of the area. They were drunk and looking for some entertainment, and they thought Heather would supply them with their fun. They immediately started to push her around in the streets. Then they mocked her, tipped up her wares so all her heather scattered on the ground. A big crowd gathered, and all from Crieff knew Heather had a quick wit and a sharp tongue, and she turned on these men. She ridiculed them, and every time she said something, the crowd would roar in laughter. Soon these 3 men felt a bit sheepish, a bit got at, so they made a hasty retreat. Heather picked up all her goods, then went to the nearby tavern to drink all her takings away. That night, Heather could be found lying in one of the closes or wynds of Crieff, wrapped in a thin tartan shawl. It was just starting to snow lightly. Heather was shivering. She tried to get herself comfortable. She thought about a time not that long ago when she was sat at a warm fire. She would look over and see her husband smiling back, safe in the knowledge that some children were asleep upstairs in their beds. Heather sighed. A tear trickled down her cheek. Then she thought she was just being a daft old woman thinking of the past. She shut her eyes and started to fall asleep. Then Heather heard voices all around. It was these 3 farmers who'd come to get their revenge. Heather was violently pulled up. She felt a blow to the head. Then the punches rained down. She was taking a savage beating. Heather fought back. She scratched one of these farmers down the cheek with her nail. But she thought her time had come. This was it. Then she heard the sound of a policeman's whistle, getting closer and closer. A passing bobby on the beat had spotted this fight, and he turned up to break it up. As he pulled aside the 2 fighting factions, before Heather could utter a word, these 3 men told the policeman that Heather had attacked them as he passed. One of the men showed the policeman a deep scratch he had down his cheek. To her horror and dismay, she was arrested, taken to the police station and locked in a cell. They went to free Heather the next morning, but she had died from her injuries. But her spirit still remains in the police station of Crieff. Men who've been locked in the cells on their own feel as though they're being watched. Policemen who go down to the cells, again when they're empty, have the same feeling that they're not alone. CCTV has caught cell doors opening by themselves and then bang, shutting again when the cells are empty. In the early 1930s, a desk sergeant was working up the stairs on his own in the dead of night. He was doing some paperwork when suddenly some unseen force within the room grabbed him by the throat and pinned him to the wall. This man struggled to breathe. This pressure was getting tighter and tighter and tighter. When suddenly the door opened and in walked a cleaner about to start their shift, and this pressure was released. The man fell to the ground. It took him a while to get his composure and his breath back. So Heather Meg is angry with the people who should have protected her that night, the police from the town of Crieff.